The landscape of Posto Avanzado Delta stretched vast and barren, its terrain coated in a fine layer of black glassy sand that shimmered faintly under the weak light of a dying star. The sky above was a swirling mosaic of ash-gray clouds, pierced, occasionally by streaks of electric blue lightning. The air was dry and metallic, tingling on the skin of anyone brave or desperate, enough to step outside the fortified walls of the human outpost. Built into a jagged ridge of volcanic rock, the Posto Delta was humanity's last foothold on this forsaken planet, a crumbling reminder of the resilience and the fragility of mankind. Inside the command center, alarms screamed, their shrill tones bouncing off the reinforced steel walls. Soldiers and engineers scrambled through narrow corridors, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of urgency and fear. Screens flickered with distorted images of the incoming fleet. Dozens of Clivthar ships descending through the planet's atmosphere, their forms sleek and alien, their surfaces pulsating with an iridescent glow that seemed almost alive. The Clivthar ships moved in perfect synchronization, a terrifying display of their technological and biological integration. "Shield integrity down to 42%, a technician shouted over the noise, her voice strained with panic. "Generator 3 isn't responding." Captain Renaud, a grizzled veteran with scars that told stories he rarely shared, slammed his fist onto the control console. "Get it online," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "If those shields drop any further, we're finished." In a dimly lit workshop buried deep within the base, Marcus Venn worked furiously over a pile of disassembled circuit boards and tangled wiring. His hands, calloused and stained with grease, moved with practiced efficiency as he soldered a critical connection. The scent of burnt metal filled the room, mingling with the acrid smell of his sweat. Marcus wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a leader, he was a mechanic, a fixer. His job was to keep the machines running, the lights on, and the weapons functional. But as the alarms echoed even down here, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that his role in this fight was about to change. The workshop door slammed open, and a young soldier stumbled in, his uniform dusty and torn. "Marcus, they need you in the generator room, now. The shield's failing." Marcus looked up from his work, his eyes narrowing. "I just finished patching that damn thing yesterday. What's wrong now?" "I don't know," the soldier stammered. "Something's interfering with the energy flow. The engineers can't figure it out." Marcus cursed under his breath and grabbed his tool belt, slinging it over his shoulder. The weight of the worn leather pouch, filled with screwdrivers, wrenches, and other tools of his trade, was both comforting and burdensome. "Lead the way," he said, his voice low but steady. The generator room was a cavernous space at the heart of the outpost, its walls lined with conduits that glowed faintly with residual energy. The main generator itself was an imposing structure of blackened steel, its core thrumming with power that sent vibrations through the floor. But something was clearly wrong. The hum was uneven, fluctuating erratically, and sparks flew from one of the primary conduits. Marcus wasted no time. He dropped to one knee in front of an access panel, yanking it open to reveal a tangle of exposed wires. His trained eyes scanned the mess, his mind already running through possible causes. "This isn't wear and tear," he muttered to himself. "This is sabotage or something worse." As he traced the wires, his fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. It was smooth and cold, and when he pulled it free, he found himself holding a small crystalline object. It was about the size of his palm, with intricate patterns etched into its surface that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The object pulsed faintly, almost as if it had a heartbeat. Marcus felt a strange warmth spread through his hand as he held it, and for a moment he forgot the chaos around him. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Before he could examine it further, the ground beneath him shook violently, throwing him off balance. The alarms grew louder, and a voice crackled through the intercom. "All personnel to battle stations. The Clivthar have breached the outer perimeter." Marcus stuffed the crystalline object into his tool belt and scrambled to his feet. He glanced back at the generator, its power levels still dangerously low. "Damn." "Hit," he growled. He grabbed a welding torch and began sealing the damaged conduit as quickly as his hands would allow. As he worked, He couldn't shake the feeling that the object he had found was somehow connected to the generator's failure. It didn't belong. There, it wasn't part of any human technology he'd ever seen. And yet, it had been embedded deep within the system, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. When the conduit was finally sealed, the generator's hum stabilized, and the shield's integrity began to climb. "Shield levels back to 56% and rising," a voice announced over the intercom, earning a collective sigh of relief from those in the command center. But Marcus didn't feel relieved. He felt unsettled. He tightened his grip on his tool belt as he made his way back to the workshop, his mind racing with questions. What was that object? How had it gotten into the generator? And why did he feel like it was somehow alive? By the time he reached the workshop, the noise of the ongoing battle outside had intensified. The sound of distant explosions rattled the walls, and the faint glow of the Clifthar energy weapons painted the sky in hues of blue and violet. Marcus sat at his workbench, pulling the crystalline object from his belt and placing it under a magnifier. The patterns etched into its surface seemed to shift as he stared at them, forming shapes and symbols that defied logic. "Marcus, we've got a situation," a voice called from the doorway. It was Captain Renaud, his face drawn and pale. "The Clifthar are advancing faster than we anticipated. We need every weapon and defense system operational, and we need it now." Marcus looked up, his expression grim. "I'll do what I can, Captain, but there's something you need to see." He held up the crystalline object, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the room. "This was inside the generator. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't belong to us." Renaud stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined the object. "That's not human," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did it come from?" "I was hoping you could tell me," Marcus replied. "But whatever it is, it's not just sitting there, it's doing something. Drawing power, maybe. And I think it's tied to the Clifthar." Renaud's jaw tightened. "If that thing's connected to them, it's a liability. Get rid of it." Marcus hesitated, his eyes lingering on the object. "I don't think we should. Not yet. It might be a liability, but it could also be the key to figuring out what they're doing and how to stop them." Renaud didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. "Fine, but don't take too long. We don't have much time." As the captain left, Marcus turned back to the object, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Whatever this thing was, it was more than just a piece of alien technology. It felt purposeful. And if Marcus had learned one thing in his years as a mechanic, it was that every tool had a purpose. The workshop's dim light flickered as the distant rumble of explosions shook the foundation of Posto Avanzado Delta. Marcus sat hunched over his workbench, the crystalline object resting in front of him like a forbidden artifact. The faint glow pulsing from its surface cast eerie shadows on the walls, and every time Marcus looked at it, he felt as though the patterns etched into it were shifting, rearranging themselves in ways that defied logic. It was as if the object were alive, or at least aware of his presence. His calloused fingers hovered over the crystalline surface, hesitant to touch it again. There was a strange warmth to it, a sensation that seemed to radiate beyond the physical, brushing against something deeper within him. Marcus wasn't the type to believe in superstition or mysticism, but this thing was testing the limits of his pragmatism. Before he could lose himself further in thought, the workshop door slid open with a metallic groan. Clara, one of the outpost's junior engineers, stepped inside, her expression a mixture of relief and urgency. She was young, barely in her mid-20s, with sharp features that betrayed a mind constantly working a mile a minute. Her jumpsuit was stained with oil and ash, and a deep gash across her forearm suggested she'd barely made it here unscathed. "Marcus," she said, her voice strained as she closed the door behind her. "We've got a bigger problem than the shields. The Clifthar aren't just breaching the perimeter, they're targeting our core systems. If they take out the reactor, we're done." Marcus looked up, frowning. "The reactor's buried 3 levels down. It's supposed to be untouchable." "They're adapting," Clara replied, her voice rising. "They've deployed some kind of swarm, small, fast, like drones, but alive. They're chewing through our automated defenses like it's nothing. We need to figure out how to stop them." Marcus glanced at the crystalline object, the faint pulse of its glow reflecting in his eyes. "And this thing?" he asked, gesturing toward it. "I found it buried in the generator. Whatever it is, it was draining power, and I'm starting to think it's connected to them." Clara stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she examined the object. "That's not human tech," she said, a note of awe in her voice. "It almost looks organic. Where did you say you found it?" "In the generator core," Marcus replied. "That shouldn't have been there, but it's definitely doing something. I can feel it." "Feel it?" Clara raised an eyebrow, skepticism creeping into her tone. "Yeah," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "It's hard to explain. When I touched it, it was like it recognized me, like it was waiting for someone to activate it." Clara folded her arms, clearly wrestling with the implications. "If this thing is connected to the Clivthar, it might be the key to understanding their tech or shutting it down." "That's what I'm hoping," Marcus said. He reached for his toolkit, pulling out a small diagnostic scanner. "Let's see if we can figure out what makes it tick." As Marcus ran the scanner over the object, the device emitted a series of high-pitched beeps. Data scrolled across its screen, but none of it made sense. The object's energy signature was unlike anything Marcus or Clara had ever seen. It fluctuated wildly, defying all known patterns of electrical flow, and its material composition was equally baffling, a seamless blend of crystalline and biological structures. "This thing is rewriting my scanner's software," Marcus muttered, his brow furrowing. "It's like it's one step ahead of me no matter what I try." "Let me see," Clara said, leaning over to study the screen. "Wait, look at this." She pointed to a section of the data feed. "That energy signature, it's the same as the Clivthar's weapons, but it's not just a match, it's stronger, denser." Marcus set the scanner down, his mind racing. "You think this could be some kind of prototype? Something the Clivthar left behind?" Clara hesitated. "Maybe, or maybe it's older than that. We've always assumed their tech was light years ahead of us. But what if this is the source of their power? What if everything they've built is based on something they didn't create but found?" Marcus stared at the object, its soft glow reflecting in his tired eyes. "If that's true, and we've got it, we might have just found the one thing that can give us a fighting chance." The intercom crackled to life, interrupting their thoughts. "All personnel report to defensive positions immediately. Enemy forces breaching inner sectors. Repeat, enemy forces breaching inner sectors." Clara cursed under her breath. "They're getting closer." Marcus grabbed the crystalline object and tucked it into a reinforced compartment on his tool belt. "We can't stay here. If they're pushing this hard, it means they're after something, and I'd bet my life it's..." "This?" Clara nodded. "We need to get this to the command center. If Renault sees this, he'll understand why we're losing ground so fast." The two of them moved quickly, navigating the narrow corridors of the outpost as the sound of combat grew louder. The walls shook with each distant explosion, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt metal and ozone. Soldiers sprinted past them, shouting orders and carrying injured comrades. The sight of their bloodied faces and desperate expressions only reinforced the gravity of the situation. When they reached the command center, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Captain Renault stood at the center of the room, barking orders to his team as screens displayed live feeds of the battle outside. The Clivthar swarm was overwhelming. The defensive lines, their biomechanical forms moving with a terrifying blend of speed and precision. The smaller drones Clara had mentioned flitted through the air like hornets, tearing through human defenses with ease. "Captain," Marcus called, pulling the crystalline object from his belt as he approached. "We need to talk. Now." Renaud turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in the strange, glowing artifact. "What the hell is that?" "It's the reason the generator failed," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "And I think it's the reason they're here." Renaud stepped closer, his expression a mixture of suspicion and intrigue. "Explain." Marcus held up the object, its glow casting faint ripples of light across the captain's face. "This thing is connected to their tech, maybe even their power source. If we can figure out how it works, we might be able to turn it against them." Renault's jaw tightened as he considered Marcus's words. And if we can't, then we're already dead, Marcus replied, his tone grim. But if we don't try, we'll never know. The captain stared at the object for a moment, longer before nodding. All right. Get it to Clara's lab and start working on it. If this thing can give us an edge, I want results, and I want them fast. As Marcus and Clara turned to leave, the intercom crackled again. This time, the voice on the other end was shaking with fear. Enemy forces, they've breached the command deck, they're inside. The command center erupted into chaos as the message crackled through the intercom. Enemy forces have breached the command deck, they're inside. The panic was palpable, with officers shouting orders over the cacophony of alarms and soldiers scrambling to secure the perimeter. Marcus and Clara exchanged a tense glance, their breath quickening as the gravity of the situation sank in. We don't have time to waste, Clara said, gripping Marcus's arm. If they're already in the command deck, it won't take them long to get here. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. We need to get this thing operational before they cut us off completely. Let's move. Together they pushed through the chaos of the command center and headed for the laboratory, a reinforced room buried deep within the outpost. The corridors were narrow, dimly lit, and reverberated with the sounds of distant gunfire and muffled explosions. Soldiers passed them in the opposite direction, their faces pale and determined as they rushed toward the conflict. As they reached the lab, Clara punched in a security code, and the heavy metal door slid open with a groan. The room was cramped, filled with outdated equipment and scattered tools, but it offered some semblance of safety, for now. Marcus placed the crystalline object carefully on a metal table at the center of the room, its faint glow casting long shadows across the walls. All right, Marcus said, rolling up his sleeves. Let's see what this thing can do. Clara powered up a diagnostic console, its screen flickering as it booted up. She glanced at Marcus. If this thing really is connected to the Clifthar, we'll need to isolate its signal first, otherwise they might be able to track us through it. Good point, Marcus said, grabbing a coil of insulated cable and connecting the object to the console. Let's put it in a virtual sandbox and see what kind of data it's sending or receiving. The moment the connection was established, the lab's lights flickered, and the console screen exploded with data. Lines of alien script scrolled across the display, interspersed with bursts of static and strange, pulsating patterns. Clara leaned in, her fingers flying over the keyboard, as she tried to make sense of it. This isn't just a signal, she muttered, her brow furrowing. It's more like a language, a code. Marcus frowned. A language? You mean this thing is trying to communicate? Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. It's not just reacting to what we're doing, it's responding. Look here. She pointed to a section of the display where symbols were repeating in a rhythmic pattern. It's almost like it's waiting for input, like it wants us to interact with it. Marcus stared at the crystalline object, its glow intensifying, as if it were aware of their conversation. If it's trying to communicate, then maybe we can use that. What happens if we feed it some data, something human? Clara hesitated. It's risky. If this thing is connected to the Clifthar, giving it access to our systems could backfire. They could use it to map our infrastructure, or worse. I get that, Marcus said, his voice steady, but sitting here doing nothing isn't going to help us. We're out of options, Clara. If we don't figure this out, we're done. Clara let out a sharp breath, then nodded. All right, let's do it. Marcus typed a series of commands into the console, uploading a small data packet containing basic human encryption patterns and communication protocols. As the data entered the crystalline object, its glow shifted from blue to a deep gold, and the symbols on the screen began to rearrange themselves. The patterns became more coherent, forming shapes and sequences that Marcus and Clara could almost recognize. It's adapting, Clara whispered, her voice tinged with both awe and fear. It's learning. The console emitted a low hum, and suddenly a voice, calm, mechanical, but undeniably sentient, spoke through the lab speakers. Connection established, identification, human origin, purpose, inquiry. Marcus and Clara froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. The voice had a strange echoing quality, as though it were coming from somewhere distant, filtered through layers of static and distortion. "Did it just—" Clara began, but Marcus cut her off. "It's talking to us," he said, his heart pounding. He stepped closer to the console, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Yes, we're human. Who or what are you?" There was a pause, and then the voice responded. "Designation: core node of Clifthar subnetwork. Origin: predecessor artifact. Purpose: energy stabilization and propagation." Clara's fingers flew over the keyboard as she captured every word. "It's a subnetwork," she said, her voice low. "This thing is part of their infrastructure, but it's calling itself a predecessor artifact. What does that mean?" Marcus's mind raced. Predecessor. It sounds like this thing predates the Clifthar. Maybe they didn't build it, maybe they found it. Clara's eyes widened. If that's true, it means their entire technology could be based on this artifact. It's not just a tool, it's the foundation of their power. Marcus turned back to the console. "Why are the Clifthar attacking us?" he asked. "What do they want?" The voice hesitated before answering. "Human energy signatures compatible with artifact propagation. Clifthar directive. Assimilation and integration." Clara's stomach turned. "Assimilation? They're not just trying to kill us. They're trying to use us. They need us," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "Whatever this thing does, it needs humans to work. That's why they're here." The console beeped, and a new message appeared on the screen. "Warning. Primary Clifthar network detecting anomaly. Reinforcements en route." "They know we're interfacing with it," Clara said, her voice rising. "We've got to—" "Shut this down, Marcus. If they send reinforcements, we're finished." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. "No, we can't just shut it down. Not yet. This is our only chance to turn the tide." Clara grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "Marcus, we don't have time to figure this out. If they break through, we're dead." Marcus met her gaze, his expression resolute. "We're already dead if we don't fight back. This thing is the key, Clara. I can feel it. We just need more time." Before Clara could respond, the lab door rattled violently, the sound of claws scraping against metal echoing through the room. The Clifthar were here. The door rattled again, harder this time, as if the Clifthar forces outside were testing its limits. The sharp screech of metal against metal reverberated through the lab, making Clara flinch. Marcus stood motionless for a moment, his eyes darting, between the crystalline object on the table and the reinforced door. "We don't have much time," Clara hissed, her voice a mixture of fear and frustration. "If they get in here—" "They won't," Marcus said firmly, cutting her off. He grabbed a welding torch from a nearby workbench and tossed it to her. "Reinforce the door. Buy us some time." Clara caught the torch, her hands trembling. "And what are you going to do?" "I'm going to figure out how to use this thing," Marcus replied, turning back to the glowing artifact. "If this is the key to stopping them, we need it working. Now." Clara hesitated for a moment before nodding and rushing to the door. She crouched near the frame and began welding the edges, sparks flying as she worked. The sound of her efforts mixed with the rhythmic pounding from the other side, creating an unsettling symphony of desperation and determination. Marcus focused on the crystalline object, his mind racing. The voice they had heard, the data streaming across the console, it was all pointing to one thing: this artifact was more than just a tool. It was a conduit, a bridge to something far greater. But how could he tap into it? How could he make it work for them instead of against them? "All right," he muttered to himself, typing a series of commands into the console. "Let's see." "What you've got." The object's glow intensified, shifting from gold to a deep pulsing crimson. The console screen flickered, and the alien symbols began to rearrange themselves into something resembling a map. Marcus leaned closer, his eyes scanning the intricate patterns. It wasn't just a map, it was a network, a vast web of connections spanning what appeared to be entire star systems. Clara glanced over her shoulder, sweat dripping down her face. "What is it?" "A map," Marcus said, his voice tinged with awe. "Or maybe more like a blueprint. This thing isn't just connected to the Clifthar. It's their foundation. Their entire infrastructure is built around it." Then why the hell is it here? Clara asked, returning to her work on the door. That's the question, isn't it? Marcus replied. He tapped the console, zooming in on one of the nodes in the network. Maybe they lost it. Maybe it's a piece of something bigger, and they've been looking for it ever since. The pounding on the door grew louder, and Marcus could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of Clifthar weapons charging. Clara cursed under her breath as she worked faster, her hands moving with frantic precision. Marcus, whatever you're doing, do it faster, she snapped. I'm trying, Marcus shot back, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He accessed the artifact's interface, searching for any clue as to how it worked. The voice returned, calm and unyielding. Access query, human entity, purpose required for authorization. Marcus froze for a moment, then spoke, his voice steady. Our purpose is survival defense. We need to stop the Clifthar. There was a long pause, and then the voice responded. Human intent aligns with artifact protocols. Limited activation authorized. Warning, energy surge imminent. The artifact's glow flared, filling the lab with a blinding light. Marcus shielded his eyes, but he could feel the energy radiating from it, a deep hum that resonated in his chest. The console beeped wildly as new data flooded the screen. Schematics, coordinates, and something else. A weapon that could disrupt the Clifthar network at its core. Clara, Marcus called, his voice cutting through the noise. I think I found it, a way to shut them down. Clara looked up from the door, her eyes wide. What are you talking about? This thing. It's connected to all of them. If we can overload it, we can disrupt their entire network. But we need to get it to their central hub. Are you insane? Clara shouted. You want to take this thing into the heart of their forces. Do you have a better idea? Marcus shot back. We're out of options, Clara. This is our only chance. Before Clara could respond, the door buckled, a sharp dent appearing in the reinforced metal. The Clifthar were nearly through. Marcus grabbed the artifact, its warmth almost searing against his skin, and stuffed it into a protective case. We need to move, he said, his voice resolute. Now. Clara abandoned the welding torch and grabbed her tablet, still connected to the console. What's the plan? We take the rover, Marcus said, already heading for the lab's secondary exit. Get to the surface and drive straight for their nexus. If we can get close enough, this thing will do the rest. That's suicide, Clara muttered, but she followed him anyway. The alternative was worse. The two of them burst out into a side corridor, the sounds of battle echoing all around them. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and ozone, and the ground shook with each explosion. Marcus led the way, his grip tight on the artifact case as they navigated the maze-like corridors. When they reached the vehicle bay, the scene was chaotic. Soldiers were loading injured comrades onto transports, while others prepared for a last stand against the advancing Clifthar. The tension in the air was palpable, every face etched with a mix of fear and determination. Marcus, a voice called. It was Captain Renault, his uniform scorched and his face smeared with ash. What the hell are you doing? Saving. All of us, Marcus replied, not breaking stride as he climbed into a rover. We're taking this straight to their nexus. Renault's eyes widened as he noticed the artifact case. You can't be serious. That's suicide. Maybe, Marcus said, starting the rover's engine. But it's the only shot we've got. Renault hesitated, then nodded grimly. Godspeed. Clara climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her tablet as the rover roared to life. Marcus gripped the wheel, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the Clifthar nexus loomed, a pulsating beacon of alien power. Hold on, he said, his voice steady. This is going to get rough. As the rover sped out of the bay, the Clifthar forces closed in behind them. Their glowing forms a relentless tide of destruction. The rover sped across the desolate terrain, its reinforced wheels grinding over jagged rocks and crumbling ash as the alien landscape stretched endlessly around them. Above, the Clifthar nexus loomed like an ominous sun, its pulsating light casting eerie shadows across the barren ground. Behind them, the relentless hum of Clifthar drones and vehicles grew louder, their glowing forms closing the distance with unnerving precision. Clara clung to the edge of her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped her tablet. "They're gaining on us," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine and the cacophony of approaching alien machines. "I know," Marcus growled, his focus razor-sharp as he maneuvered the rover through the uneven terrain. "This thing wasn't built for speed, but it'll get us there." Clara glanced at the glowing artifact resting in its protective case between them. Its pulsing light had grown brighter and more erratic, as though it was responding to the proximity of the Nexus. "The artifact, it's doing something. I think it's reacting to the network." Marcus shot her a quick glance. "What do you mean?" "It's like it's syncing with the Nexus," she said, frantically scrolling through the data on her tablet. "The energy readings are spiking. If we get close enough, it might trigger something." "Let's hope it's something that doesn't kill us," Marcus muttered under his breath. The rover jolted violently as it hit a hidden crater, nearly tipping over. Clara let out a yelp, clutching the tablet to her chest as Marcus fought to regain control. "Watch it. Do you want to drive?" Marcus shot back, his voice tinged with frustration. Before Clara could respond, the first wave of Clivthar drones descended from the sky, their sleek, bioluminescent bodies cutting through the air like predatory birds. Their weapons ignited, sending bolts of energy streaking toward the rover. Marcus swerved sharply, narrowly avoiding the blasts as they scorched the ground in brilliant flashes of blue and white. "Hold on!" Marcus shouted, gripping the wheel tightly as he veered toward a narrow canyon. The rocky walls rose steeply on either side, offering some cover from the aerial assault. The drones followed, their movements fluid and calculated, weaving effortlessly through the narrow space. Clara leaned out of the rover, her hands shaking as she aimed a small energy rifle mounted on the vehicle's side. "Keep it steady," she yelled. "This is as steady as it's gonna get," Marcus snapped, dodging another barrage of energy bolts. Clara fired, the weapon emitting a sharp crack as it sent a beam of concentrated energy toward the nearest drone. The shot hit its mark, piercing the drone's core and sending it spiraling into the canyon wall in a shower of sparks. "One down," she shouted, adrenaline surging through her veins. "Only about a dozen more to go," Marcus retorted, his voice strained as he pushed the rover to its limits. The canyon opened into a wide, flat expanse, and the Nexus now dominated the horizon. Its size was staggering, a massive, pulsating structure of light and metal that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The ground around it glowed faintly, etched with alien patterns that shimmered and shifted like a living organism. The closer they got, the more intense the artifact's pulsing became, its light now a blinding beacon in the rover's cabin. Clara shielded her eyes, her voice trembling. "Marcus, this thing, it's overheating. I don't think it's supposed to do this." "We're almost there," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Just hold it together a little longer." The Clivthar forces were relentless. Larger vehicles appeared on the horizon, their towering forms bristling with weapons. That glowed ominously. A massive walker emerged from the swarm, its long articulated legs carrying it across the terrain with terrifying speed. Its central core pulsed with the same energy as the Nexus, and its weapons charged with a low, menacing hum. "We can't outrun that," Clara said, panic rising in her voice. "We're not trying to outrun it," Marcus replied, his jaw set, with determination. "We're going straight through it." "Are you insane?" Clara yelled. "That thing will tear us apart." Marcus didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the Nexus, now looming directly ahead. The artifact in its case was glowing so brightly that the entire cabin was bathed in golden light, its pulsing synchronized with the rhythms of the alien structure. As they approached the Nexus, the ground beneath the rover began to quake. The yow patterns etched into the earth glowed brighter, and a low resonant hum filled the air. Marcus gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as the rover barreled toward what looked like the Nexus's central core, a massive, spiraling structure that seemed to rise and fall like the beating of a giant heart. "Marcus, this is suicide," Clara screamed, her voice breaking. "Trust me," Marcus shouted back, his voice unwavering. "This is the only way." The walker closed in behind them, its weapons locking onto the rover. Energy beams fired, one of them grazing the vehicle and sending sparks flying. The rover shuddered, but Marcus didn't slow down. His focus was absolute, his entire being consumed by the single goal of reaching the nexus. As they neared the core, the artifact began to emit a high-pitched whine, its energy building to a crescendo. Clara stared at it, her face pale. "Marcus, if this thing blows—" "It won't," Marcus interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "It's not here to destroy us. It's here to end them." The rover reached the edge of the nexus, its massive doors sliding open as if in response to the artifact's presence. Marcus didn't hesitate. He drove straight inside, the walls of the structure closing around them as the Clifthar forces outside fired futilely at the impenetrable surface. Inside, the air was still, the hum of the nexus resonating in perfect harmony with the artifact. Marcus stopped the rover and grabbed the case, his movements deliberate and calm. He stepped out, his boots echoing against the metallic floor as he approached the core. Clara followed, her heart pounding. "What are you doing?" "Finishing this," Marcus said, placing the artifact into a circular slot at the center of the core. The moment it connected, the entire structure lit up, the patterns on the walls dancing with blinding energy. The nexus began to tremble, its hum growing louder and deeper. Outside, the Clifthar forces faltered, their movements becoming erratic. As their connection to the network was severed, the massive walker collapsed, its legs crumpling beneath it as its core dimmed and faded. Marcus and Clara stood in the center of the nexus, the energy around them reaching its peak. Marcus looked at her, a faint smile on his face. This is it. The artifact released a final pulse of energy, and everything went white. The white light slowly faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Clara blinked, her vision blurred and her ears ringing. She staggered, her hands instinctively reaching out to steady herself against the smooth metallic walls of the nexus. The once pulsating structure was now still, its alien patterns dim and lifeless, as if the energy that had powered it for centuries had been drained entirely. "Marcus!" Clara called out, her voice trembling. She turned to see him lying on the metallic floor near the core, the artifact still nestled in its slot. Its glow had completely vanished, leaving it cold and inert. Clara rushed to his side, her heart pounding in her chest. "Marcus, wake up!" she shouted, shaking his shoulder. His face was pale, his body motionless. She pressed her fingers to his neck, relief flooding through her as she felt a faint pulse. "You idiot," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You actually did it." Outside, the battlefield had changed. The Clifthar forces were immobilized, their once menacing machines now silent husks scattered across the terrain. The massive walker lay collapsed in a heap of metallic limbs, its core completely extinguished. The drones that had pursued them hung lifeless in the air before crashing to the ground, their eerie glow snuffed out. Human soldiers cautiously emerged from their defensive positions, their weapons still raised, unsure of what had just occurred. Captain Renault stood at the edge of the battlefield, his gaze fixed on the nexus. The structure, once a beacon of Clifthar power, now appeared as a hollowed-out shell, its light extinguished. The oppressive hum that had filled the air was gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness. "What just happened?" one of the soldiers asked, lowering his rifle. "The Clifthar. They've stopped," Renault said, his voice tinged with disbelief. I think we've won." Inside the nexus, Clara managed to prop Marcus up against the wall. His eyes fluttered open, and he let out a weak groan. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Yeah, Marcus, it worked. You shut them down." Marcus managed a faint smile, his exhaustion evident. "Told you it would." Clara helped him to his feet, her arms supporting his weight as they made their way back to the rover. The artifact remained in the core, its purpose fulfilled. As they stepped outside, the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting its warm light over the battlefield. The surviving humans looked up, their faces a mixture of relief and triumph. "What now?" Clara asked as they climbed into the rover, the distant cheers of their comrades echoing around them. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his eyes closing. "Now we rebuild," he said softly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And this time we make sure no one ever messes with us again." The rover rumbled to life, carrying them back toward the outpost as humanity's first true victory against. The Clifthar marked the dawn of a new era,